In this video, I'm going to demonstrate how to set up a WireGuard VPN server on OPNsense so that you can connect remotely to your home network in a secure fashion to be able to access various apps and services or other devices that you have on your network. I basically set up the same firewall rules and permissions that I have set up on my WireGuard instance as I do for my home network, so that way I can seamlessly roam from home and somewhere else and be able to still access everything as though I'm connected to my home network. It works really well to access, say, like security cameras and various other devices and services and stuff that I don't normally expose to the internet. So let's get started. I'm going to show you the WireGuard open configuration in OPNsense, and then I'll move on to showing an example of how you can access something behind WireGuard. So I'm on the latest version of OPNsense on my virtual machine here on my lab network, and I'm on the dashboard right now. So what we're going to do is we're going to set up the WireGuard server. So let's go to the VPN section and click on WireGuard and click on instances. Notice there's nothing here yet, so we are going to click the plus icon to add a new instance, and we'll just call this, uniquely call it WireGuard VPN. It can be called whatever you want. You can't have any spaces in the name, so we'll just enter something like this so you know what this connection is for. If you have multiple ones, you might want to call this on home or work or whatever location that you are using the WireGuard server. And in here we can generate a new key pair, which is what you want to do for the public and private keys. It used to be you had to hit save and then go back in to see what they are later, but now you can just generate them right here from this interface. So they've updated some of this WireGuard user interface, which is nice, very helpful. You have to enter a listen port. The default for WireGuard is 51820. This is required to be entered, even though that's the default port normally for WireGuard. You still have to include it in here, otherwise it will not work properly. That's where you might get tripped up if you assume it's going to put the default value in there and it doesn't. Tunnel address, this is going to be the network address for your WireGuard server, so I'm going to make it like 10.11.11.1/24. I'm going to make it some kind of random, network that is not going to be used by any networks that I'm connecting from or to. So we've got to make sure this network doesn't overlap with any IP addresses that's on your OPNsense box or any networks you're connecting from. We're not going to worry about CARP because we're not doing high availability, and we're not worrying about peers right now either because we need to set that up later. But you can select some peers here if you already have some created already, but we don't have to worry about that. And we don't want to disable routes because we want traffic to be routed with the default behavior of WireGuard. So let's just click save. You'll see we have the WireGuard instance here. We're not going to enable everything until we're ready to get everything set up and ready to go. So now we got this peers and peers generator page. So the peers page, it will show all the peers that we've created. You can create them manually if you go here and hit add. This is how you used to have to create peers, and you can still do it this way, but this is a more manual way of doing it compared to the peer generator. The nice thing about the peer generator is it automatically picks the next available IP address that you can use in your network and automatically generates a public and private key. And it will put in your allowed IPs by default, which is basically allowing all traffic to be tunneled through the network. But you'll see it creates this config file down here, which is very cool because this is what you can use to copy paste in for, say, Linux machines or other clients. You can copy paste this, but you'll also see there's a QR code here. This is very new to the WireGuard, and this is something that users have been wanting a long time in OPNsense, and it's finally here. So we can use the QR code here for mobile clients, so you can use either one of these configs because this QR code represents everything that's in here, and a mobile client will just pick up all the configuration and be off to the races very quickly. Okay, for endpoint, this is what your client, the peer that we're setting up, is going to use to connect to your WireGuard server instance that's set up here on OPNsense. You ideally would put a host name in here, preferably if this is on the edge of your network, it's going to be a public domain name that you can use. It could be a dynamic DNS name or a domain name you own, but it'll have your public IP address in that. But since something is internal in a network, you can actually just use the IP address here. So what I'm going to do is go to interfaces and go to overview so I can see what that is. I'll show you here on the WAN interface. This is an internal IP address. So I can go ahead and copy and paste this. This is what I'm going to be using for all of my peers. for the endpoint. And so that way we know this is what our internal address is. So let's go back to VPN, and we'll go to WireGuard, and we'll go to peer generator. Okay, and so we'll just put that as our endpoint address. Okay, and we also need to put in here the port number. So we got to put colon and then the port number, so that it has the full address and the port that it's going to be connecting to. It doesn't assume 51820, so we have to put that in there. And this is going to be the name of the peer, and you can't put spaces in this just like in the WireGuard instance. So we could just call this user 1, whatever you want to call it. I'm just using this as an example. And you see it generates a public private key, as I mentioned. Okay, then we have the next available IP address, which is great. If you want to put an extra like password on here for a pre-shared key, basically that's what that is, a little passphrase you can put in there. It's not really completely necessary, but it adds a little extra layer of security if you're worried about somebody getting access to your private keys or whatever. So allow IPs, we'll leave it for all, tunnel all traffic through. And we need to put in a DNS server here because it will not default to the interface IP address here. I don't think you think it should do that, but it's just better just to specify this so there's no issues here. And that's going to be the WireGuard interface IP we're putting in here is 10.11.11.1. So we need to include that in there. And notice if I click off here, it's going to add that to my WireGuard configuration. All right, so before we click store and generate next, you should copy and paste this configuration to say a Linux client if you're doing it via command line, or if you have a mobile app, you can go ahead and scan this right now before you continue. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to just show you how to do it on a Linux client, but because a mobile phone is pretty self-explanatory, you just open up the WireGuard app and scan this code, and that's pretty much all you have to do to add that WireGuard instance in there. So that's super simple for mobile phones, but I'm just going to do a Linux client just so it's easier for me to demonstrate this on a virtual machine that I can do a screen capture for. So I'm going to copy paste this. I'm going to move over to my other virtual machine that I have open. So I have it open over here. I just have a web browser open, happen to have it open. So normally you would put this under, say if I just do sudo nano and etc, then WireGuard, and then you would do wg0.conf. Normally you would put, let me put my password in here. So normally you would put it in a file like this. This is one I was playing around with. It's not the actual one I have here, but normally you would put in this wg0.conf file, and that would work great. You would just put all that stuff in there. But I want to show you another way you can do it. The nice thing about using Kubuntu, not Ubuntu, and go to configure on the network icon down here, you can go to hit add new connection, and then at the very bottom here, you'll see they have WireGuard as an option to select, and you can create a WireGuard connection just straight from the user interface. What I'm going to do is I'm going to open up a notepad here, and I'm going to paste that configuration so I can look at it. Oops. And if I can move it out of the way here. So let's give this connection a name. Let's just call it WireGuard. When I did this earlier, I didn't put a name in there and didn't like it very well, so it didn't save my configuration. So I'm going to do it this time. Make sure you put the name in at the top. We're going to put in the private key, which if you come over here, you'll see our private key is our first line. So we'll click on copy and we'll paste that there. You can see that it's red, pink, meaning it's required. You got to have a private key. And then we'll click on peers, and the peer information is basically what's in the bottom section here, the config file that we copy pasted. So it will be right here for the public key. And the public key, it's easy to match these fields up, and you'll see the endpoint address match up with the endpoint address up here. And notice there's a separate place for port number. We don't have to put it all in one line like the config file because there's a separate box for it. And then the allowed IPs down here at the bottom can go in the allowed IPs box. So everything matches up pretty easy. It's like all named the same, so very, very simple. If you had a pre-shared key, you'd put it in there. And you may or may not want to keep a live option here. It's to help keep the connection open, especially if you're traversing through a NAT firewall. Sometimes those connections might drop out or close out if it's idling for too long. That's what that's mostly used for. So let's click OK. And let's go to IPv4, and this is going to be similar to how you configure a static IP in Kubuntu anyway for normal wired connections. So we'll just click on the method and we'll click on manual. And so we're going to copy paste this DNS server. It's just 10.11.11.1. Okay, and then we'll click on add down here, and then we'll type in the IP address. I'll just copy and paste to make it easier, and we'll just make it .2 because that's what we have it configured as on the WireGuard. The net mask is going to default to 255.0.0.0, but we want 255.255. Oops. Let me type it in. Okay, 255.0, because we made this a /24 network, so that means the last octet needs to be 0. All right, and so let's go to the gateway is going to be the same as the DNS server. It's just basically the WireGuard interface IP. So we'll just click on save on that, right? So now we have a WireGuard connection here that says it's never been used, so that's great. So we'll use this to turn on and off our connection with WireGuard. And so before we do that, I'm going to just hit OK. All right, and we'll go back to our other VM. I didn't save this configuration yet, so now that I got this set up here, I'm just going to click on Store and Generate Next, and you'll see up here it pre-fills this stuff. Now that I put in additional information in here, it'll keep that for the next set of clients, which is great because I don't have to type anything in anymore. So I had to fill in a few extra pieces of information, but at that point on, everything just defaults to that, which is great. And as you'll see, it picks .3 for the next client. So you'll go over to peers up here at the top. You'll see there's our first peer that we have added to the instance here. So if we go over to instance, you'll see there is a peers option or a column here, and you see if I hit refresh, it shows it there. So that's something that's different than the older WireGuard plugins. The peers, you had to go back and edit this WireGuard instance here like this and go in and add your additional peers, but you don't have to do that anymore. So anytime you create a new peer through the peer generator, it will automatically add the peer to the instance, because if you look at the top here, we're picking the instance we want this peer to be on. So because of that, if you had more than one instance, you have to make sure you pick the proper instance up here. So I just wanted to mention that little difference there between the old WireGuard and the current WireGuard functionality. It's a lot better. All right, so let's go back to the instances, and we're going to enable the WireGuard instance. All right, so now that that's enabled, you'll see that if you go to status, we can see if there's been any handshakes because we have a user in here now. And so whenever you connect, it'll show this handshake, but we're not quite done yet. So this is just gets the WireGuard VPN set up. So if you want to connect remotely and in a secure manner to your home network, but also use the network or the internet of your home network, you need to set up a interface in OPNsense for the WireGuard instance, because this will automatically do the NAT translation for you, and it'll be just like you're participating on any other network on your home network, and that's like the ideal way of doing it. So let's go to interfaces, and we're going to go to assignments. Now, when you create a WireGuard instance, it'll automatically show up as a device down here at the bottom. So you can just see WG0, WireGuard instance. So it's the first instance. So it'll start with 0 and it'll start incrementing up if you create multiple WireGuard VPN instances. All right, so we can call this WG, just for WireGuard for short, and click add. All right, and so now that we've added this interface that shows up over here on the left in the menu. Okay, so now we need to click on the WireGuard interface because it's not enabled yet. So we just need to click enable interface, and you can prevent interface removal. So it just basically hides the option to delete this interface, so you can accidentally delete it. We don't need to specify any IP configuration because we've already done that in the WireGuard instance. So we just hit save and click apply changes. Okay, now that we have that applied, if you go over now to firewall rules, you'll see that there's a WireGuard interface in the rules. And you also see this WireGuard group. This is automatically created. The WireGuard group, in case you're curious about what that is, these are, if you want to put rules that apply to all WireGuard instances that you have set up, you can create rules in there. But for the most part, if you only have one WireGuard instance, or you want to have completely separate firewall rules, you just want to make sure you put the rules on the actual instance here and not anywhere else. And so what we want to do in here, we need to create some firewall rules to get basic access to our network. Because if we have it like this, you're not going to be able to access anything with no firewall rules, because everything will be blocked automatically. It says right here, everything will be blocked until you add a pass rule. So we can create firewall rules now, basically the same as we do for any other network. And so I'm going to go to the LAN interface, So here's like the bare minimum rules I typically have for each network. You can ignore the first 2 rules because these are the allow all rules that come with OPNsense. I just have them disabled so you can see what they look like. But the bottom 2, I usually allow DNS through the network interface that I'm currently on. You can see I'm on the LAN interface. So I allow DNS on the LAN address, which is the gateway interface IP address for that network. So I allow DNS, and then I basically block using, here's all the private IPv4 addresses. It's an alias that has all those in it, and I block all of the private IP addresses by default, but allow public IP addresses. So this gets you access to the internet, but blocks all of your local network access. So this basically isolates each network on your network, which I've explained before in other videos and on my website. But if you want to allow additional access, you can just create rules above this rule at the bottom. So we're going to clone these rules. I hit clone just to save us some time creating rules a little bit. Then we'll pick the interface. We'll pick WG. You can just type in WG, and then down here for WG net instead of LAN net, and WG address instead of LAN address. And we can keep the description the same. Hit save. You'll see that it added it to the WireGuard interface. And then we'll go back to LAN and we'll duplicate this other rule. We'll clone it, and we'll say make sure we change that to WG for the interface, and then WG net instead of LAN net. And then the private IP address networks, and this is the option in destination invert, which means not this. So it's, it inverts it. So we'll just hit save on that. All right, and we need to make sure we put this bottom rule up to the top because we want the private network blocking on the bottom. And so we'll just hit apply changes. Okay, so this is the bare minimum that we'll need to be able to connect to WireGuard. Okay, so now we need one more rule so we can allow clients to connect to our WireGuard instance. We need to add it to the WAN interface because users will be connecting from outside the network into our network. So we need to go to the WAN interface and click on the add for the rule. And we want it to be protocol UDP because that's what WireGuard uses. And the source will be any, and then the destination is going to be the WAN address. So we can type in WAN here, and it'll be WAN address. So anything that's coming and hitting our WAN interface, and the destination port, which is our WAN for our WireGuard. Remember, we made it 51820, and we can copy paste this over to this box because we don't need a range. We just need a single port number. And we can say allow access to the WireGuard VPN, okay, server or whatever, right, on OpenSense. Okay, so let's click save. And we can click apply changes here. And then now we will have allowed access on the WAN interface. I want to make note of one thing before moving on, that if I go to my WAN interface, there's a block private networks and block bogon networks. Since I'm doing this on my internal network, I don't want to block private IP addresses from entering into the WAN interface. So you want to uncheck these 2 options, especially the first one is more important for this purpose. But you want to make sure you uncheck that. If you're doing this on your internal network, do not do this if you're on your public network because it's not as safe and secure. But for an internal network, this is what you do. I just want to make sure that I point that out, that this is why this works on my internal network, because otherwise you're going to have your incoming addresses being blocked because we're going to be connecting from our internal network to another internal network. Okay. So I just want to make note of that. Okay, so let's go over back to the VPN, and we're going to see if we can connect to our VPN. So I'm going to switch over to my other window here. So I'm actually on a different network on my internal network because you notice I was on the .110 network. Now I'm on the .20 network for this VM. I want to make note of that because if you're on the same network as your WAN interface, you might have trouble connecting in because both the client and the server are kind of on the same network, so you have like the same gateways and stuff. And I don't know if it creates a routing loop or what, but it does not work very well that way. There's probably ways to make that work, but just to simulate a real world example anyway, you're going to be on a different network when you're connecting into your WireGuard. You're not going to be on the same network as your ISP's WAN interface. So this should work as a good example of showing what it's like to connect in from the outside world. Before I connect to WireGuard, because you'll see that I have a connection here, I'll have to just hit connect. I want to mention that I created a firewall rule on my main OpenSense box to allow access from my other network, which is my .20 network, to my 110 network for the IP address of my virtualized router. Normally, you wouldn't have to do that if you're on the public internet because we already have created a WAN firewall rule. I'm just letting you know that because I have my networks isolated, I had to create an additional rule to make this work. So if you're trying to connect from a different network on your home network and to try to recreate this, you got to be aware of the fact that how your rules are set up. If you have your networks isolated, you might need to create another rule to allow access to your lab or virtualized environment network. All right, so now we're going to connect to our WireGuard instance. So let's go down here and click connect. It says it's activated, but doesn't mean it's working because WireGuard tends to be stateless, UDP, so you don't really know that it's working until you see a handshake at OpenSense. So let's go back over to our OpenSense VM and click on status, and you'll see if I refresh, make sure I'm still getting data here, you'll see a handshake timestamp and a send receive amount, and that indicates that you're connected through. And I should be able to, if I go back to my VM, I should be able to get access to the internet. All right, so that's good. And you'll know that it's going through the WireGuard VPN because if I go back here and we'll test out, if I change my firewall rules for WireGuard, and let's say I disable both of these just to test this out, to prove that these rules are really doing something, we'll disable these rules and hit apply. Okay. And then we'll go back to the WireGuard VPN here, and then we'll try to go to Microsoft.com, and you'll see that I can't get anywhere. It's just spinning, right? So now we know that all of our traffic's being tunneled through WireGuard because it's not accessing the internet anymore. So that's great. So let's go back and change that. It's a quick little test there. And I have a server that I set up behind WireGuard on my virtualized instance. So I'm going to show an example. If you want to access something inside your network, we can just add a rule for it. So let's do this. It's going to be on the internal network behind my virtualized OpenSense. So let's click on add rule here, and we're going to do protocols just TCP, and it's just the homepage server. So destination is going to be, go to single host. And 192.168, and it's going to be 30.10. And the destination port, it's going to be the 3000 because this is the homepage server's default port. It's a homepage dashboard server, I should say. Allow access to homepage dashboard. And I can capitalize this because that's a name of a software, right? Homepage dashboard. We'll hit save, and we just need to make sure we need to move it up below the bottom rule. I usually like to put the rules in between the interface rules and the bottom rule. Doesn't really matter as long as it's above the bottom rule. I'm gonna hit apply. I forgot here on the source, it's better to be more specific instead of saying any. I forgot to pick, let's go back here and fix it. Instead of letting it pick any, we'll just do WG net, right? So we'll be a little more specific. Right, so there we go, and we'll just hit apply changes. All right, now that we added that rule, let's go back to our other virtual machine. All right, and we're going to see how Microsoft popped up since I enabled the rules. So let's do HTTP. It's not even HTTPS. It'll be 192.168.30.10, 3000. So that worked. That's great. So we can get access to our homepage server here. This is just the default installation with no changes. So the interesting thing is here is I can use my internal IP addresses to connect to anything on my internal network, exactly the same as if I was home connected to everything, even though I'm connected remotely. You can even use host names as well inside your network because it's going to use the DNS server, unbound DNS by default, on your WireGuard interface IP address. So any local host names will resolve on your WireGuard VPN connection. So you can even use your bookmarks or whatever that you have set up and use everything by domain name. So that's very interesting. And so I thought that would be a good example to show that you can connect to something behind, WireGuard VPN. I can do the same test again here if I disable this rule that hit yes here and hit apply. I'll show that you can't access it anymore. So just to show that I'm accessing something behind here. Yeah. So now I'm trying to access it and it's just sitting there spinning, right? I hope you found it helpful to see an example of what you can do after you get your WireGuard VPN set up on accessing an example app or service you have hosted on your network. But all you have to do essentially is just create firewall rules to allow access to different parts of your network. So until next time, I'll see you guys later.